In this lecture, we are going to examine the era of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the process of bringing the former Confederate States back into the Union and determining what kind of freedom Black Americans would have in American society. The generally recognized dates for Reconstruction are 1863 to 1877. Now, the era of Reconstruction poses a lot of questions, but two main questions stick out. First, what will Reconstruction mean for the states that seceded? And second, what will Reconstruction mean for Black Americans? And beneath these two fundamental questions are many other questions. How drastic will Reconstruction be on the former Confederate states? Despite emancipation as one of the outcomes of the war, will the South be able to keep its political, social, and economic institutions? Or will the South be radically altered and remade in the image of the North? Will the South be punished? Will the South be occupied by the Union Army? What will freedom look like for former slaves? Will they have freedom and equality or just freedom? Then there is the question of who will guide and implement Reconstruction. Will it be the President or will it be Congress? Now, other questions for you to consider, what are Abraham Lincoln's views of Reconstruction? What are Andrew Johnson's views on Reconstruction? What did Republicans want Reconstruction to look like? What did Democrats want Reconstruction to look like? What did Southerners want Reconstruction to look like? What did former slaves want Reconstruction to look like? So there's lots of questions we got to look at. Now, Lincoln began the process of Reconstruction during the Civil War. As Confederate states were captured, they had to be brought back into the Union. In December 1863, Lincoln presented his plan for Reconstruction. It was known as the 10% Plan. Lincoln offered a presidential pardon to former rebels who would swear an oath of allegiance to the United States. They must follow all presidential proclamations and congressional actions regarding slavery. Now, Lincoln did exclude certain Confederate political, military, and diplomatic leaders from his pardon. Lincoln stated that when 10% of the 1860 voting population of a state took the oath of allegiance, they could establish new state governments. These new state governments must recognize emancipation, however, and that's it. That is all Lincoln requires of them. There was no plan for a harsh punishment or massive confiscation of Southern plantations. Now, radical Republicans were very upset with Lincoln's plans. There's basically three factions of the Republicans during Reconstruction: conservative, moderates, and radicals. Now, all three factions agreed during the Civil War that the Confederacy must be defeated and that emancipation must be supported. Many conservatives and moderates supported emancipation, though, as a war measure, while the radicals supported it because they believed from the start of the war that emancipation needed to be a war aim. The radicals wanted guarantees of protection for former slaves, such as the right to vote and to own land and to farm. They wanted harsher terms for the states that seceded. They wanted land to be confiscated from Southern planters. They believe Lincoln's 10% plan is way too low. Basically, to sum it up, the radicals thought Lincoln's plan was too lenient. Thaddeus Stevens was the leading radical Republican in the House of Representatives. He's a representative from Pennsylvania. He had a great hatred of the South. His Caledonia furnace was destroyed by the Confederate soldiers in Robert E. Lee's 1863 invasion of Pennsylvania. He not only wanted to grant blacks equality, but he wanted to punish the South and to remake it in the image of the North. One of these, I got a quote here to kind of show you how he felt about the South. He said, "Reconstruction must revolutionize Southern institutions, habits, and manners. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relaid, or all our blood and treasure will have been spent in vain." Now, Lincoln and the radicals had different philosophical or constitutional views on the seceding states. Lincoln argued that the states never really seceded. Reconstruction is just about the loyal citizens of the South regaining control of their state governments. Basically, during the Civil War, rebels took control of the states, but the states never seceded. This basically means that the states have to be let back into the Union more or less as they were, with the big exception being that there's no more slavery. The radical Republicans' argument went like this: secession was state suicide. The states did leave the Union. This meant that they no longer had constitutional rights under the Constitution. They were like territories. They had reverted back to that state, and it was up to Congress to determine the terms on which they would re-enter the Union. Reconstruction was not as simple as Lincoln was making it out to be. The radical Republicans put forth their own version of Reconstruction in the Wade-Davis bill. Benjamin Franklin Wade was a Republican senator from Ohio, and Henry Winter Davis was a Republican representative from Maryland. Their bill was put forth in July of 1864, and it's much harsher than Lincoln's. Instead of 10%, the Wade-Davis bill required that 50% of the 1860 voters must take an oath of allegiance. These voters can call a state constitutional convention then, but they could only vote for delegates that took the ironclad oath. The ironclad oath required that you had never supported the Confederacy. Now, Lincoln kills this bill with a pocket veto. Basically means he just didn't sign it into law. He just lets it expire at the end of a congressional session. The radicals were very upset with him, and they responded with the Wade-Davis Manifesto in August of 1868. Basically, they said, Congress passes laws, and it's the president's job to execute them, not to make laws himself. Now, some Reconstruction actually went on the battlefield or by the generals. After his march to the sea in late 1864, General Sherman and Secretary of War Stanton had a meeting with a group of freed people in January 1865 in Savannah, Georgia. The Reverend Garrison Frazier was the freed black who spoke for the blacks that met with Sherman and Stanton. Sherman asked him a lot of questions. What should be done with black refugees following the armies? What does emancipation mean to you? What does it mean to have freedom? Frazier basically says this: the freedom, as I understand it, promised by the Emancipation Proclamation is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor. The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. We want to be placed on land until we're able to buy it and to make it our own. So as a result, Sherman issues Special Field Order 15. Over 400,000 acres of land are given to blacks for settlement along the Sea Islands and the coasts of Georgia and South Carolina, and the black families are given 40 acres and a mule to farm this land. Another thing during the war was the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865. This bureau was formed to help blacks make the adjustment from slavery to freedom by providing various services. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, shelter, jobs, education, and legal advice and contracts to freedmen. It placed blacks on public lands so they could farm them and kind of support themselves. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped black and white refugees, so it gave food and shelter to people displaced by the war. Now, Lincoln did want reconciliation with the South, but by the end of the war, he was moving closer to the radicals' position. And just before he is assassinated, he revealed that he was going to make a statement on Reconstruction just a few days before he's killed. But since he's killed, we don't know what he was going to say, but he was probably leaning more towards the radical position. Now Andrew Johnson becomes president. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee. He was a lifelong Democrat. His hero was Andrew Jackson. He was the only Democrat from a Confederate state who did not walk out of the Senate to join with secession in 1860-61. Lincoln put him on the ticket in 1864 to help get votes from the Democrats in the North that wanted to continue the war. Now, Johnson grew up poor. He taught himself to read and write, and he made his living as a tailor. Johnson hates the planter class of the South. He did not like blacks either, but he really hated the planters. Johnson once said after he became president, "Treason is a crime and must be made odious." Johnson talks about confiscating land and punishing the South. So radical Republicans think at first, this is going to be our guy. He's going to go along with us. But not long into his presidency, his actions revealed that he would not support radical Reconstruction. He offered amnesty and property restoration to rebels who took an oath of allegiance. He exempted Confederate leaders and large planters from this pardon, but he left the door open for them to apply individually for pardons, and many of them do throughout 1865. He also outlined what the former Confederate states had to do to re-enter the Union, and it's much simpler than Lincoln. First, they must repudiate secession, they must guarantee emancipation, and they must protect Unionists in the South. But beyond that, that's basically it. So very easy for the Confederate States to come back into the Union. Now, Congress was powerless to stop Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction. The Congress that was elected in November 1864 would not meet until December 1865. Johnson becomes president when Lincoln is killed in April 1865. So basically, from April to December, Congress is not in session, and Johnson can do whatever he wants in Reconstruction. And that the Confederate States, the former Confederate States, they take advantage of Johnson's leniency. Some Confederate states refuse to repudiate secession. Some elect former Confederates to high offices. Some refuse to ratify the 13th Amendment ending slavery. Many enact things called black codes. These were restrictions on blacks' ability to travel, to hold jobs, to quit their jobs, to own a gun. It restricted their ability to buy or rent land. There are many other restrictions as well. Unemployed blacks could be arrested under these black codes and have their labor auctioned off. So basically, it's like slavery. Some Confederate states, former Confederate states, establish state militias that are dominated by ex-Confederate generals. Now, Johnson ends up pardoning over 13,000 planters that apply for a presidential pardon. So basically, while he's president and Congress is not in session, Reconstruction is very favorable to the former Confederate states, and it's not very favorable to the freed blacks. Johnson, like Lincoln, saw Reconstruction as the prerogative of the president. Lincoln, though, would have preferred more protections for blacks in the South, but Johnson doesn't want this. Now, the 39th Congress would meet in December 1865. This was the first Congress to meet since the war ended. Republicans had a huge 3-1 majority over Democrats. There were conservative, moderate, and radical Republicans, and though there are many intra-party differences, the Republicans generally agreed on a number of things. They agreed not to seat officials elected from states reconstructed by Johnson in 1865. Something like over 60 former Confederates had been elected to Congress from the former Confederate states. This included generals and cabinet officers and even the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Hamilton Stevens. Now, Thaddeus Stevens, he said this about Confederates coming back to Congress: "Do not, I pray, admit those who have slaughtered 500,000 of our countrymen until their clothes are dried, until they are reclad. I do not wish to sit side by side with men whose garments smell of the blood of my kindred." Now, this angered Northern Democrats, who insisted that Washington get out of the way and let Southerners govern their own part of the country. Now, radical Republicans agree that blacks should be protected against discrimination and intimidation in the South, and generally Republicans in general agreed to this. Now, the Republican Congress created something called a Joint Congressional Committee on Reconstruction, and from 1866 on, they took control of Reconstruction. Sorry, that's my cat. Now, the Joint Congressional Committee on Reconstruction passed a number of bills. The Freedmen's Bureau Act called for the life of the Freedmen's Bureau to be extended. The Civil Rights Act did a number of things. It declared that blacks are citizens. It nullified the black codes. It granted some property rights and legal rights for blacks. Johnson vetoed both of these bills, but Congress overrode his vetoes, and they became law. The Civil Rights Act became law in April 1866, and the Freedmen's Bureau was extended in July of 1866. Now, during Reconstruction, blacks practiced their freedom in many different ways. What blacks wanted most was land and education. This would allow them to become independent in addition to being free. Blacks opened up their own schools, churches, and businesses. They also voted and ran for political office, and they took part in political parties. This may have been the most revolutionary change of the Civil War. You know, former slaves voting and holding office, whereas before the Civil War, they couldn't do either of those things. Blacks also purchased guns and formed militias to protect themselves from groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Some blacks abandoned social customs that forced them into an inferior position, such as tipping their hat to a white person or moving out of the way to let a white person walk by. Some blacks wanted to move as far away from their master's plantation as possible, a sort of escape. Others felt that since they had built that plantation with their own blood and sweat, they had a right to its land. Many plantations were divided up among former slaves. The masters had fled during the Civil War. But when their former masters obtained a pardon from President Johnson, the land went back to the masters. Slaves were then forced into a system of farming called sharecropping, or the former slaves were. The plantation owner would provide the freedmen with land and seed and tools, but the freedmen then owed a certain portion of their crop to the plantation owner. Often the freedmen only made enough to pay back the plantation owner for the land rent, the seed, and the tools. So in many instances, sharecropping tied freedmen to the land, sort of in a similar way that slavery did. Now, another thing Congress did is pass the 14th Amendment. They did this in June of 1866. The 14th Amendment made the former slaves citizens of the United States and citizens of the states in which they resided. It prohibited the states from denying any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It guaranteed equal protection of the laws. It also excluded many ex-Confederates from holding office. Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment quickly in July of 1866, and they're the first state to be reconstructed. Now, President Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment. He encouraged the ex-Confederate states not to ratify it, and it will be remembered that it took 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment for it to become part of the Constitution, and this 3/4 of the states includes former Confederate states. So it's not just the North or the Union that has to ratify these amendments, it's also the South. Now, despite Andrew Johnson's opposition, the 14th Amendment will make it into the Constitution in July of 1868. But in the fall of 1866, right after it's written, Johnson goes on something called a swing around the circle. It's a campaign in the fall 1866 elections. He campaigns against the 14th Amendment, and he tries to get Democrats elected. This swing around the circle is a total failure. Johnson battles hecklers when he gives speeches. He calls Republicans traitors. He even compares himself to Jesus Christ by saying that he was being crucified because of radical Reconstruction. This is really offensive to many people in the North who, on the one hand, are religious, but on the other hand, think of Lincoln as a more apt comparison to Jesus, because Lincoln actually was killed for something, whereas Johnson hasn't been killed. The election results come in, and Republicans win a huge majority in Congress. Republicans employed a tactic called waving the bloody shirt. Basically, during the election, Republicans remind the voters that the Democrats are the ones that started the Civil War. The Civil War is their fault. Here's a quote from Oliver Morton. He's a Republican politician, and this is what waving the bloody shirt means. Every unregenerated rebel calls himself a Democrat. Every bounty jumper, every sneak who ran away from the draft calls himself a Democrat. Every man who murdered Union prisoners by cruelty and starvation calls himself a Democrat. Every New York rioter in 1863 who burned up little children in colored asylums, who robbed, ravished, and murdered indiscriminately calls himself a Democrat. In short, the Democratic Party may be described as a common sewer into which is emptied every element of inhumanity and barbarism which has discolored the age. So that's what waving the bloody shirt looks like. Now, in 1867, Republicans will go even farther and enact even more far-reaching Reconstruction legislation. Congress passes 2 Reconstruction Acts in March of 1867. Johnson vetoes both of them, but then Congress overrides his veto. These Reconstruction Acts did a number of things. They nullified all the state governments of the former Confederacy except Tennessee. They divided the South into 5 military districts. They said that states can only be readmitted when they accept black suffrage and the 14th Amendment. So these Reconstruction Acts give black men the right to vote, basically. They also said that military commanders were supposed to enroll blacks to vote, and it disqualified about 10% of the white South, former Confederates, basically. Now, Congress also passed the Tenure of Office Act in March 1867 over Johnson's veto. The Tenure of Office Act said an official cannot be removed if their position was required Senate ratification. This law was basically meant to protect Edwin M. Stanton. The Tenure of Office Act was probably unconstitutional because it violates a president's ability to appoint his advisors or get rid of his advisors. but they passed it nonetheless. Now, there was a power struggle between Johnson and Congress. In late 1867, early 1868, Johnson removed Stanton as Secretary of War. There's a lot of drama involved in this. Johnson did violate the Tenure of Office Act through his removal of Stanton. Johnson did this on purpose because he wants to test the constitutionality of the law. And as a result, the House of Representatives votes in February 1868 to impeach Johnson. They do this on a straight party vote. The Senate then holds an 11-week trial from March to May 1868. There were 11 articles of impeachment against Johnson, but the Senate voted 35-19 to convict Johnson, which is one vote short of convicting him. So basically, a majority of senators wanted to convict him, but they fell one vote short. 12 Democrats and 7 Republicans voted no. Now, Johnson starts to cooperate with Congress after his impeachment, and basically he lets Congress take the lead in Reconstruction. Now, in the South, the Republican vision for Reconstruction was being implemented. 3 groups in the South were foundational to the Republican Party. Blacks in the South, carpetbaggers, and scalawags. Carpetbaggers are Northerners who go south and basically get involved in politics and start running businesses. Scalawags were Southern Unionists who basically joined the Republican Party. They're kind of seen as traitors to the Democrat South. Now, blacks and carpetbaggers and scalawags begin to build up the Republican Party in the South. And by the fall of 1867, there's hundreds of thousands of new voters registered. About 735,000 blacks are registered to vote, and about 635,000 whites are registered to vote. About 200,000 of those were Republican voters of the white voters. Now, many white Southerners within the former Confederacy, they refused to register to vote, so basically they boycott the system. A number of states in the South had black majorities, such as South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, and Alabama. So these states are overwhelmingly Republican. Now, throughout the South, constitutional conventions were held, and delegates to the state constitutional conventions were about 3/4 Republican and 1/4 Democrat. The constitutions then enacted by the Republicans in the South include a lot of reform. They enact universal manhood suffrage. They set up public school systems in the South. They enact prison reform throughout the South. Republicans win elections and they form new state governments in the South. These new state legislatures ratify the 14th Amendment. So by the summer of 1868, the Republican governments in the South push the 14th Amendment past the threshold and it's ratified. So without the Republicans in the South, the 14th Amendment would not have become part of the Constitution. And with the passage of the 14th Amendment as a backdrop, the presidential election of 1868 takes place. It's a referendum on Republican Reconstruction. Ulysses S. Grant runs as the Republican candidate against Horatio Seymour, the Democrat candidate. Horatio Seymour was a former reform governor of New York. Republicans once again waved the bloody shirt. They praised their Reconstruction policies. Grant's campaign slogan was "Let us have peace." The Democrats slander Republicans with charges of black rule. They call for white supremacy in the South. Horatio Seymour's slogan was, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." There's lots of violence in the South. Seymour does receive a majority of the white vote, while Grant receives practically all the black vote. Blacks in the South help push Grant over the threshold. He ends up getting 55% of the total popular vote, and he wins 214-80 in the Electoral College, and he also wins 26 states to Seymour's 8. Republicans win 2/3 of the House and 4/5 of the Senate, so this election is a huge landslide for the Republicans. In the wake of their victory, Republicans then push for the 15th Amendment, which would give black men the right to vote. The Republicans believe it's the right thing to do, but it will also help their party in the South if the right to vote is guaranteed in the Constitution. There's some charges of hypocrisy against the North. 11 northern states still did not let blacks vote. So some people say, how can you force the South to let blacks vote when you don't even do this in the North. But nevertheless, Congress passes the 15th Amendment in February 1869, and then it's ratified in 1870. Now, President Grant takes many steps during his presidency to enforce Reconstruction and protect black and white Republicans in the South. After Georgia expelled all the black delegates from its state legislature in 1868, Grant and Congress took action that resulted in the blacks getting their elected seats in the legislature back. Grant cracks down on the Ku Klux Klan in the South. In the fall of 1871, he declares martial law in South Carolina and he crushes the Klan. In September 1874, after white leaguers attacked New Orleans and seized the Republican-held legislature, Grant sent 5,000 troops and 3 gunboats to New Orleans. They enter the State House and they remove the white leaguers and restore the Republican representatives. In March 1875, Grant signs the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This act says, "All persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement." So basically, this law says that you can't have segregation. So this is a very forward-thinking law. Now, after the passage of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, many Americans start to think that maybe they've done all they need to do regarding Reconstruction. In April 1870, the New York Tribune said, "Let us be done with Reconstruction. The country is sick and tired of it. Let us have peace." But Reconstruction is going to last another 7 years throughout the entire presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Ultimately, a few things end up bringing Reconstruction to an end. Grant's administration is full of corruption. Although he's personally honest, there's many scandals in his administration. There's a gold panic scandal. There was a customs house ring scandal. There was a whiskey ring scandal. Basically, it's difficult on the one hand for Grant to implement Reconstruction while all these scandals are going on. It just gives ammunition to the Democrat Party. There's also charges of corruption against the blacks in the South, the carpetbaggers in the South, the scalawags in the South. Basically, the Republican governments in the South are charged with corruption. Now, it's important to keep in mind that, yes, there is some corruption in the South by blacks, by carpetbaggers, by scalawags, but they're not any more corrupt than, white Democrats in the North or in the South. This era, kind of the era after the Civil War, has a wide reputation for corruption in government. So it's unfair to focus on the South as a special place of corruption. It was going on everywhere. Now, there's a lot of blacks in government during the era of Reconstruction, both at the state level and the national level. Between 1868 and 1877, there were 14 representatives to the House of Representatives who were black. There's 2 senators from Mississippi who were black. Blacks held about 10 to 15% of state offices throughout the South. They never held a governorship, though. The reasons blacks were elected to office is because they were in the majority population in a number of states, and because of the fact that Northern troops, both black and white, stood guard at the ballot box. And finally, another reason that Reconstruction came to an end was the Panic of 1873. Financial houses in America collapsed in the fall of 1873, and many Americans are thrown out of work. It's just a fact of politics that in hard economic times, people are less interested in reform than they are in getting back on their feet. So in essence, this panic distracted the nation from Reconstruction. So as a result of all these factors, white Democrats began to retake control in the South, and Reconstruction starts to come to an end. The process where white Democrats in the South gain control of state governments is called redemption. So when a state is redeemed, the black and white Republicans are thrown out of office and white Democrats rule the state again. Between 1869 and 1874, 7 states are redeemed in the South. One thing that helped Democrats redeem the South was the Ku Klux Klan. This was founded during Reconstruction. The Klan was made up of white Democrats who used terrorism to suppress blacks and the Republican Party. We are aware that blacks were targeted by the Klan but whites are also targeted if they were a part of the Republican Party. The historian Eric Foner said, in effect, the Klan was a military force serving the interests of the Democrat Party, the planter class, and all those who desired restoration of white supremacy. The Ku Klux Klan whipped, beat, kidnapped, mutilated, and hanged thousands of blacks and white Republicans in the South. They often whipped their victims in the front yard of their house in front of their family. Oliver Wyatt, a black leader of the Loyal Republican League, was dragged from his home by 100 whites in front of his family and hanged from a courthouse in North Carolina. Henry Pinkston was castrated, and his wife Eliza was raped, and her baby was killed. Then Henry, the husband, was killed by white regulators. So there's, hundreds, if not thousands, of stories of individuals being targeted because of their political activities. Congress responds to this violence with a number of laws in the 1870s. These laws have lots of different names, such as the Enforcement Acts, Civil Rights Acts, or the Ku Klux Klan Acts. In 1870, Congress passes an Enforcement Act. It makes it a federal crime for two or more people to act together or to go in disguise and deprive a person of a right or privilege of citizenship. So this is specifically targeted against the Klan. In 1871, Congress passes the Ku Klux Klan Acts. This gave the president the power to declare martial law in the South and to deal with the Klan. And Grant did clamp down on the Klan in the South. Now, in 1872, Grant runs for re-election. It's a very strange election. His opponent was Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune. Greeley was a fellow Republican, but he wanted Reconstruction to come to an end, and he represented the Republicans who were upset with corruption within the Grant administration. And in an odd twist, the Democrats also nominated Greeley in an effort to get Grant out of office and to bring an end to Reconstruction. It was a very bitter campaign. One cartoon showed Greeley reaching over the grave of Abraham Lincoln to shake hands with John Wilkes Booth. Frederick Douglass spoke out. He said, "I know Grant well. At all times he gave every aid to the development of the industry of the improvement of the colored races." But of Greeley, he said, "Greeley is an uncertain man, an inconsistent man, one whom you do not know today and can give no guess what he will do tomorrow, what he will say tomorrow, what principles he will advocate, what measures he will propose." Grant ends up winning the election, which is a good thing because Greeley ends up dying a few weeks after the election, so you might have had some type of crisis if Greeley had won the election, but Grant easily wins the election. Now, in Grant's second term, the Democrats make more gains politically. The Panic of 1873 helps them. Democrats win back the House of Representatives in 1874. This is the first time they had won the House in 18 years. In the state elections of 1875, the Democrats put in place something called the Mississippi Plan. They put all sorts of pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, social pressure on whites and blacks in the South to not vote Republican. They also employed violence to achieve their ends. Democratic rifle clubs would use mob violence and terrorist attacks to intimidate potential Republican voters. In 1874, just prior to the Mississippi Plan, there's a large riot in Vicksburg that leaves almost 40 blacks dead. The result of this and then the Mississippi Plan is that Democrats win the state of Mississippi. So by 1876, only the state governments of South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida are in Republican hands. Republicans nominate Civil War General Rutherford B. Hayes for president. The Democrats nominate Samuel J. Tilden, who was the reformed governor of New York. Now, Tilden wins all of the redeemed states in the South, along with many states in the North, including New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Indiana. If he wins one of those three Republican states in the South, South Carolina, Florida, or Louisiana, he will win the presidency. What ends up happening is we don't really know who won those three southern states. The Republicans in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana declare Hayes the winner. They control the states. But the Democrats in the state also claim that Tilden won the state. Congress ends up setting a commission to find out who the real winner is. This commission is made up of 15 people, 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. But the independent, Justice David Davis, he's elected to the Senate during this whole controversy. So he removes himself from the commission, and a Republican takes his place. Well, then the Republican Commission has an 8-7 advantage, so they vote to give those 3 states electoral votes to Hayes. So the Senate accepts this decision. The Senate is controlled by Republicans, but the House is controlled by Democrats, and they resist this outcome. There's fears that when March of 1877 comes around, that's when the president is inaugurated. The nation won't have a president because the Republicans in the House, or the Senate, and the Democrats in the House will basically create a deadlock, and we won't have a president. What ends up happening is something called the Compromise of 1877 is struck. Hayes promises to withdraw federal troops from the South, allowing redemption to take place. He asks that blacks be respected in their rights. He promises Southerners that he will appoint them to federal positions. He promises to invest money for internal improvements in the South. And in return for promising these things to the South, the Democrats decide to give him the election. So basically, Hayes ends up being elected president. And then after he's inaugurated, he withdraws federal troops from the South. Democrats do not end up respecting blacks' rights, and segregation and Jim Crow end up becoming the norm in the South. Now, after Reconstruction, something called the Lost Cause comes into play. The Lost Cause is just basically this belief that the Confederacy during the Civil War was this heroic cause. The values of the antebellum South were very virtuous. The war was not a struggle over slavery. The war was a struggle for states' rights, for constitutional government. The Confederacy was not to blame for starting the Civil War. The war was actually a war of northern aggression. At the same time, the Lost Cause minimizes the role slavery played in the Civil War. And writers in the South push this view of the Lost Cause. There's movies made about the Lost Cause. The Birth of a Nation is this story about how the Klan is this heroic organization that basically saves the South from terrible government that the blacks and the Republicans were imposing on them. Gone with the Wind, there's a part in the book and the movie where it shows blacks and whites from the northern whites and blacks in the South basically taking over the South, taking over the businesses, over the plantations, and basically not running them well. So there's all kinds of cultural things that kind of push this Lost Cause narrative. Now, that's basically the end of Reconstruction. I want to just mention a little bit about Grant. Grant has a really interesting life after he leaves the White House. He does a number of things. He participates in a lot of religious causes. He's a big pusher of the Sunday school movement, which was basically to teach Christianity and also to educate people. Sunday school movements kind of morphed into education in many ways. Grant flirts with running for a third term in 1876, but he ends up not running. Grant attends the Centennial Exposition in 1876 in Philadelphia, the 100-year celebration of the United States of America. Grant goes on a world tour from May of 1877 to September of 1879 after he's left the presidency. He visits all kinds of world leaders. He's a celebrity around the world. Towards the end of his life, he lost his life savings. He basically got duped by a business partner, but he teams up with Mark Twain to write his memoirs of his life and his time as general in the Civil War. And they're a huge success. He ends up making a lot of money just before he dies, so he can let his family kind of live off of his memoirs. And Grant passes away in 1885. And I'll leave you with this. This is Walt Whitman's kind of tribute to Grant and how great of an American he was.